Okay, so we just left off in the last discussion with this notion of, quote, racial formation. And racial formation is really the primary way that scholars today think and conceptualize about race. Okay, the way they think about race, the way they conceptualize it, the way they historicize it. Okay, that is to say, even in the past, when we think about the social construction of race, they are indeed examples of racial formations. All right. So I just mentioned the social construction of race. So this is wedded to that idea. Okay. In fact, it's a crucial part of it, integral part of racial formation. But as I mentioned earlier, it's a way to think about the social construction of race while bringing in the fold the way institutions and the law and social movements interact in that definition. And one thing about racial formation, as conceived by the two scholars here, Omi and Winant, who wrote a book on this theory, right? And as I mentioned, since then, it's the primary theoretical framework to think about race. One thing that they discuss or they remind us is that race is always changing, right? It assumes different ideas, different forms, different ways to think about it throughout history, and hence it's a social construction. But it also reminds us this, and this is something I discussed a while back, that even though race is a social construction, it has a social reality. Okay, it does have an effect on social reality. Okay, so that notion right there is really the heart of racial formation. Okay, so again, here's their definition. The socio-historical process by which racial categories are created, inhabited, transformed, and destroyed. Okay, so it's a process, obviously, when you look at these terms like created, inhabited, transformed, and destroyed. That is to say, race is a social construction that is shaped by political, economic, and cultural forces. This gives race a social reality, even though it is indeed, a social fiction, right? Okay, so again, just to go over the ideas here, it says a socio-historical process. And again, this connects to the idea that race does not exist biologically as a static definition. It constantly changes. Certainly, it can't be defined by science, as we know, right? Uh, in other words, yeah, it's not existing biologically. Rather, it's shaped by political, economic, and cultural forces, as I just described here. Okay. Now, when it says created, inhabited, okay, that makes sense. But it also talks about it being transformed and even destroyed. So, what does that mean? That race is transformed and destroyed. Well, this brings in how official definitions that, again, are imposed or foisted upon such groups, whether African American, Irish American, Asian American, right? These official definitions are externally imposed upon such groups, for example, by the state or the government, right? But then members of that group challenge it, they contest it, and often, historically speaking, that leads to that destruction of that older category, the older way to categorize officially these groups, only to be replaced by newer ones. Okay, so this is what we mean by transformed and destroyed. And again, this is profoundly historical. That should be readily apparent to you. Now, a big part of their discussion here is the notion of the state project or the state racial project. Okay, and I just mentioned that race is shaped by, let's say, politics, right? Institutions, even cultural forces. So the state racial project, as mentioned here, are laws or policies by the state that uses ideas about race to organize people and or to distribute power or resources. Okay, so even economics you can see is involved here. Um, so any action or any policy by the government that you know foregrounds race, right? It's used to organize people. It's used to distribute power, political power, what have you, economic power. The state interprets these racial dynamics at any given time, and then they fashion policy or fashion laws. For example, the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, right? Or here's some examples that are stated here on the slide. Okay, uh, Omi and Winant emphasize that the state racial projects, okay, they centrally involve race and it leads to racial definition. But that doesn't necessarily mean they're racist, okay? Sure, they can be racist. That's obvious with Jim Crow laws, okay? But they could even be anti-racist, or they could be in the spirit of combating racism, like the civil rights laws. Let's say the 1964 Civil Rights Act or the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Okay, some of them can have this veneer of being neutral, even though sometimes neutrality is merely a veneer, as I mentioned, right? For example, here is the case of the 1980 census, as we discussed, officially appropriating the term that was first created by Asian Americans, right? And that's the term Asian American, officially adopting that as a racial category of the U.S. Census, or used by the U.S. Census. Okay, so on the face of it, at least, prima facie, it seems to be a neutral move, a neutral position here, compared to, let's say, Jim Crow laws, right? Okay, so what Omi would not engage with is, let's say, in Asian American history, you could cite specific hallmarks in that history, right? Landmark acts and laws that you could interpret as racial projects. Okay, in fact, the narrative of Asian American history is replete with these state racial projects. Okay. All right. For example, the Page Act, which we discussed a long time ago in this course. Let's recall that this prohibited Chinese women on the pretense that they were immoral, that they posed a moral threat that could lead to the moral decay of U.S. society. So the Page Act defined Chinese women as a racial danger to the United States, to American society. Okay, the actual law itself claimed it was preventing the entry of, quote, prostitutes and criminals. But in practice, it racialized Chinese women as immoral, as diseased, right? Remember the yellow peril, that was part of that stigma and that stereotype. It racialized Chinese women as sexually deviant, okay? And this created, and it spread actually, racial meaning that Chinese women are immoral and a threat to American society. Okay, that's the racial meaning that was created by this law. So it's a racial project insofar as it used the state, the government, or our legal apparatus, right, to enforce that racial meaning. And this was the state acting on these racialized assumptions to control a group here, okay, namely the Chinese. And in fact, it contributed racial meaning about the Chinese in general. Okay, that should be obvious again. And moreover, it redistributed power along social lines. Remember, I talked about how it could actually distribute power, right, in a political sense. How does it do this? Well, how does the Page Act do this? That is, well, by blocking or barring Chinese women, from entering the United States, It made it harder for Chinese men to form families and to build communities. And you don't have, therefore, significant community formation that could actually, lead to the augmenting of political power, for example, among the Chinese in the United States at that time. So you could see how this gendered law, the Page Act, actually is a state racial project. Okay, and obviously it's not anti-racist or neutral. It is indeed racist. Now, still another state racial project that is, again, racist is obviously Japanese American internment. Okay, and we know the story behind this. Even those born in the U.S., the Nisei, right, were essentialized as, foreigners, as Japanese, essentially Japanese, right, non-American, according to the U.S. state, and therefore they must be imprisoned during World War II. Okay, so you can see how the social construction of race leads to policies that perpetuates the notion of the foreignness, so to speak, of the Japanese, right? And later we'll see the 1965 Immigration Act. Okay, and this is actually anti-racist. We're going to discuss this in significant detail later with this topic of Asian American politics. But for now, just remember that the 1965 Immigration Act was the law passed during the height of the Civil Rights era, if you notice 1965, right? And the law was passed to overturn our previous racist laws in the United States, specifically the 1924 Immigration Act and the national origins quota that was connected to that racist law.